Today we're back with more of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and we're going to do some summarizing and some symbolisms and characterization from Chapter 2. So I usually like to start with one of the more famous quotes from each of the chapters, so we're going to start off with our narrator, Nick Carraway, who is looking at a billboard faded in the Valley of the Ashes, and he says, "The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. Their retinas are 1 yard high. They look out of no face, but instead form a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which pass over a non-existent nose." So let's start with the summary of Chapter 2 of The Great Gatsby. Nick and Tom decide to get on the train and go to New York City. And on the way, Nick meets Tom's mistress, Myrtle. He didn't want to get off the train to meet the mistress. After all, Daisy is his cousin, and he's got a little set of values and morals, so he doesn't want to go and meet this mistress, but Tom practically forces him off the train. Now, Nick mentions how shameless Tom is in taking Myrtle out in public. No matter who may see them, he takes her out to very public places in New York City where others are going to realize that he is with her. Now, Myrtle takes advantage of Tom's money. She spends it on absolutely silly things. As soon as we get into town, she's buying perfumes and she's buying magazines. She even buys a dog. Tom and Myrtle host a small party in their apartment, and so she buys more things in order to kind of have this 1920s glam party indoors with alcohol and basically inviting up anybody who can come. Now, the party differs from the Buchanans in Chapter 1 because this one is noisy and wild. It was very silent and almost overly long. It's almost overbearing for Nick in Chapter 1, how long the party went. This one, we are getting drunk and it's noisy and it's wild. There's music going on. It is similar, however, because there is this air of boredom. Nick doesn't like either of the parties. So Nick hears rumors about Tom and Daisy's marriage at this particular party, at how neither of them can stand one another. And in spending Tom's money, Myrtle becomes very arrogant towards the less well-off, even though she and her husband would be included in that less well-off. Now, she's in the novel as yet another commentary on wealth and class, one of our major themes. Her attitude exemplifies what money can do to a person. So even though she is from the lower class, as soon as she gets money, she wants to expend it extravagantly and on silly things. Tom's senseless attack on Myrtle goes back to the issue of consequence. So Tom's allegiance is to Daisy. He knows that he needs to stay married to her for the sense of morality, for the sense of class, for the sense of wealth and old money. Yet he thinks that he can just boss Myrtle around, and when she starts having an argument with him, he attacks her. He physically attacks her. And Tom doesn't need to worry about any reaction to what he does because she's not going to go to the hospital. She's not going to go to the police. She doesn't want Tom to drop her because she'd rather have this money and this lifestyle. So Myrtle puts up with it. We are introduced to a couple of new characters, George and Myrtle Wilson. So looking at Myrtle's husband, George, as with many of Fitzgerald's characters, the name George Wilson is carefully chosen to reflect certain traits and ideals. We have President Wilson, who took the Americans into World War I, and during the peace process, Wilson was outmaneuvered by England, France, and Italy, and unwilling to compromise his ideals. Wilson set out across the country working to sell his positions to Americans. So he's very stubborn. He's very... Even though he feels like he's outmaneuvered, he feels like the world is against him, he's still very stubborn against the world, a lot like President Wilson was. He worked himself too hard and became ill, eventually suffering a stroke, and so Wilson eventually died a defeated idealist. Now, our character, George Wilson, is also a defeated idealist, living in the Valley of the Ashes. He's unwilling to compromise his ideals about his marriage, and he's become very ill in the fight. He doesn't know that Tom and Myrtle are together, but he has his suspicions that Myrtle is not being faithful to him, and it's making him ill. Now, George is the name of the United States' first president, and just as Fitzgerald intends to illustrate how the American dream has deteriorated, George Wilson in the Valley of Ashes indicates this waste of potential greatness. George Wilson is a hard worker, he's an entrepreneur, he seems to be intelligent, but he's absolutely defeated by his wife, by his circumstances, by the lack of economics and wealth. He is absolutely defeated. So we're looking at the symbol of the place itself where they live, the Valley of the Ashes. It represents a sense of the modern world, how industry has taken over, and yet we're looking at the evils of industry, how it's very pollutant, how the lower class has to live by near their jobs and they have to deal with the pollution, how the upper class does not have to be anywhere near this and they don't seem to care, how the workers have to work in this particular living conditions, and how the owners do not care about their workers. We also have in the Valley of Ashes the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. Now these eyes are from a faded billboard that overlooks Wilson's garage. It's on the very highest point of the Valley of Ashes looking down. And the eyes are always mentioned every time Nick is in the Valley of the Ashes. As he looks up through the smoke and the smog of the ashes, you can see through the clouds of smoke these eyes just looking down. And since it's faded and there is no telling the tone or the feelings of the eyes, it always feels like we have these eyes of God kind of looking down. So they look over the situation objectively, but it seems to be offering judgment on the characters and their actions. So we're looking again at some of our themes, and I would suggest to go back to my introduction to The Great Gatsby if you'd like to see all of them. In particular for Chapter 2, we have a little bit of spiritlessness in George Wilson where we feel defeated. We don't seem to have anything positive going for us. The sense of escape, the sense of not needing to live for tomorrow, only live for today. Myrtle Wilson believes that she can change class, that someday she and Tom are going to be together, that she can, always have his money, that she can always have his attention. And it's pretty obvious in Chapter 2 that this is never going to happen, but Myrtle pretends that it's going to. There's always this sense of escapism in that. Hypocrisy as well. Tom's hypocrisy, his selfishness, his brutality. People are below him. When he hurts Myrtle, he's not defending Daisy, but he's actually brutalizing her. The sense of power that Tom has over Myrtle and over Daisy in chapters 1 and 2, where he has absolutely no fear of retribution, that he is in control of these women. He's not going to defend either of them. He can just brutalize them and keep them at bay. So what is Chapter 2 in the book for? Well, we have a sense of the Valley of the Ashes trying to talk a little bit about the economic conditions as we start getting through the Progressive era and start moving more into the modern era. And a lot of times Fitzgerald is going to use the description of number 2 to kind of create that sense of forelonging, that sense of foreboding, that sense of foreshadowing, if you will, about the negativity that's about to happen in the book. So a lot of times he'll use his figures of speech, for example, as alliteration, in order to create a musical effect. Some examples that we see in Chapter 2 are railroad and runs, a fantastic farm, the grotesque gardens, how the cars are crawling, there's obscure operations. We also have the characters themselves giving a sense of who they are and what they stand for. So when we take a look about the idea about Tom through Nick's words about him, Nick says about Tom, I think he tanked up a good deal at luncheon, and his determination to have my company bordered on violence. So Tom is used to bossing people around and almost physically moving and pushing people around, and we see that happening to Nick in Chapter 2, and he allows it to happen. Now, it also foreshadows the fact that Tom, particularly after drinking, may exhibit violent tendencies. Perhaps one of his women may experience the unpleasantness of abuse by the end of the chapter. She's said to be very beautiful by people who ought to know, Myrtle says. Now, when she says things like people who ought to know, as though there's some in society who set the standards for others, it seems that thought's acceptable to her, that there are haves and have-nots in society. She believes that she should be a have, that she would know the people who are haves, even though she comes from a lower class society herself. And that ought to do it. If you'd like to stop by again, I have more chapters. If you'd like to go back and check out my introduction to Chapter 1, please check out on the channel. If you'd like to hear more about The Great Gatsby, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you could subscribe to my channel. Thanks for stopping by.